It was during a scorching summer a few years back when I took on a weird gig I found on Craigslist. I was in my final year of college, drowning in assignments and totally broke. I had landed an unpaid internship at a tiny design firm, which only made my money problems worse. I was still living with my parents, so expenses weren't too crazy, but I really wanted some financial independence. The plan was to find a side gig just for the weekends, something easy like yard work since I had plenty of experience helping my grandparents with their lawn. After scrolling through Craigslist for days, I came across a promising ad. A guy named Craig was looking for someone to clean up the yard of a property he had just bought in Clearwater. The pay was good, and he mentioned there could be more jobs if I did well. I messaged him, and he got back to me in just a few hours. We set up a quick meeting at a downtown coffee shop. Craig seemed friendly enough, dressed pretty casual, and seemed in a rush. He explained he bought old houses to fix up and rent out. The house he needed help with was kind of out of the way, and needed the grass cut, some shrubs trimmed, and a few flowers planted. He promised I'd get paid the same day as long as I finished the work. The following Saturday, I drove out to the address he gave me. It was this old, isolated house, way back from the main road with tall grass and woods behind it. Craig wasn't there but had texted me instructions, asking me to get started and let him know when I was nearly done. I started mowing the overgrown lawn with the mower Craig had left in the shed. It was exhausting but manageable. About an hour into it, while working near the back of the yard close to the tree line, I noticed something odd. A dark figure stood at one of the upstairs windows, just staring at me. I froze, trying to figure out if my eyes were playing tricks. When I focused, the figure backed away from the window. I shook it off, thinking it might be a nosy neighbor or something. But the house looked completely empty, and that weird sense of being watched stuck with me. As I kept working, trimming the bushes and starting to plant the flowers, I saw the figure again. This time he was standing at the same window, half his face in the shadows, making no effort to hide. That's when I decided to call Craig. He answered quickly, and when I asked if someone was supposed to be staying in the house, he said no. When I described the man in the window, Craig got quiet for a moment. Then he said he was on his way and told me to wait in my car while he called the cops. I walked back to my car, keeping my eyes locked on the house. The man had disappeared again. About 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up, followed closely by Craig's black SUV. The cops went inside while I explained the whole situation to Craig. After a quick search, the officers came out and said the house was empty, no signs of forced entry. Craig looked uneasy but paid me in advance and asked me to finish the job. Feeling uneasy, I went back to the yard, wrapping up the planting and clearing the last of the branches. As I carried the debris towards the edge of the woods, that same disturbing sensation returned. Hidden between the trees, partially behind a large oak, was the same man, just standing there, watching me. I kept my cool, acting like I hadn't noticed him. Dropping the branches quickly, I walked back toward my car, keeping a calm pace while my heart pounded like crazy. Once inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped off without looking back. Later that evening, I called Craig again to let him know what I'd seen. His response was strange, short, and tense. He simply said, "I'll take care of it," before hanging up. No explanation, no questions. To this day, I never figured out who that man was or how he got inside the house. But that chilling feeling of being watched has never really left me, especially when I'm alone in quiet places. A few years ago, I was trying to sell my mountain bike on Craigslist. It was a high-end model, still in great condition, but I had recently upgraded to a newer one for competitions, so I figured it was time to let go of the old one. I'd used Craigslist before to buy and sell stuff and never had any issues, so I didn't think twice before posting the ad. I took some clear photos of the bike, showing the gears, frame, and suspension, and wrote a detailed description in the listing. The next day, I got a message from a guy named Alex. He asked if the bike was still available and seemed pretty interested, saying it was exactly what he was looking for. After chatting a bit about the bike's condition, we agreed he'd swing by the next evening to check it out. I left the bike in my backyard, leaned against a metal stand where it was easy to see and ready for him to inspect. That night, Alex showed up right on time and rang the doorbell. When I opened the door, he seemed friendly, polite, and genuinely curious about the bike. I walked him out to the yard, where he checked out the bike closely, feeling the tires, shifting the gears, and testing the suspension. He even asked if he could ride it a little down the sidewalk, which I had no problem with. After a few minutes, he returned and said he liked it, but was still considering other options. I was a bit disappointed but understood. He thanked me for my time and left. I figured that was the end of it and hoped another buyer would come along soon. Later that night, around midnight, I heard a strange noise outside, like the creaking of a gate. It came from the side yard, where I usually kept the bike locked with a basic padlock. My neighborhood was pretty quiet, so hearing anything that late immediately put me on edge. I got up and peeked through the living room curtain. My stomach dropped when I saw someone standing right next to the bike. The streetlight gave me just enough light to recognize the face. It was Alex. He was inspecting the bike again, but this time way too closely. I watched as he touched the handlebars, squeezed the brakes, and then tried to spin the pedals, though. The bike was still secured to the stand. Then I saw him move toward the padlock on the gate. My pulse spiked and I decided to confront him. I opened the front door and called out, "Alex, what are you doing here?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I was honestly freaked out. He whipped around, looking totally startled. For a second, he just stared at me like a deer caught in headlights. Then, without saying a word, he turned, jogged back to his car parked down the block, and sped off into the night. I stood there in the doorway, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. Why would he come back like that? Was he really trying to steal the bike, or was there something else going on? The whole situation felt off, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. The next morning, I decided to send Alex a text, just to ask what was up. I kept it polite, saying I noticed him by the bike last night, and wanted to check if there was some misunderstanding. But when I hit send, the message didn't go through. He had blocked me. That was when the reality of the situation really hit me. This wasn't just some harmless misunderstanding. It felt calculated, like he had planned to come back and take the bike when he thought no one would notice. I reported the whole incident to Craigslist, just to be safe, though I never heard back from them. Since then, I've been way more cautious when selling anything online. I even installed security cameras around the house just for peace of mind. I never saw Alex again, but to this day, I wonder what he was really planning that night and what could have happened if I hadn't caught him in time. I used to use Craigslist now and then to get rid of old stuff and make some extra cash. I'd had a few good deals there before, so I never really worried much about safety. But one weird experience changed my mind forever. Once, I decided to sell a gaming laptop I wasn't using anymore. It was still in great shape, fully functional, and even came with some extra accessories like a gaming mouse and keyboard. Since it was a high-value item, I figured it would attract buyers fast. I took some detailed pictures and posted the ad, confident someone would reach out soon. Sure enough, the next day, a guy named Eric messaged me. He seemed pretty straightforward and super interested. He asked when he could pick up the laptop and if the price was firm. I told him yes, and he agreed without even trying to negotiate. When he asked for my address, I suggested meeting in a grocery store parking lot, figuring it was public and safer. We agreed to meet the following evening. When I arrived, Eric showed up just a few minutes later, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He seemed a bit jittery, but I tried not to overthink it. I showed him the laptop, powered it on to prove it worked perfectly, and then asked about the payment. That's when things started getting weird. Eric suddenly said he didn't have the money on him but promised to pay me in a few days. I was caught off guard and told him straight up that I couldn't hand over the laptop without full payment. He kept saying he really needed it and asked me to trust him. I stayed firm, packed the laptop back in my bag, and told him my listing would stay up until he had the cash. Eric began pleading, practically begging me to let him take the laptop. I stayed calm but firm, explaining once again that I wasn't comfortable with the deal. When I got into my car, he backed off slightly, but as soon as I started reversing, he slammed his hand against my driver's side window, yelling for me to hear him out. My heart was pounding, but I told him to back away. Trying to stay composed, I pulled out of the parking lot, but when I checked my rearview mirror, I saw Eric's car following me closely. At first, I thought maybe he was just heading in the same direction, but when I made a random turn, he did the same. My stomach tightened. I knew he was following me on purpose. I tried to shake him by making a few more random turns, but he stuck close behind me, driving so close it felt like he might ram my car. I debated calling the cops, but then thought of a better idea. I'd drive straight to the nearest police station. I quickly searched for the closest police station on my GPS and headed straight there, my hands gripping the wheel tighter with every turn. Eric was still tailing me, his headlights glaring in my mirror like he was trying to intimidate me. I could feel my pulse in my ears, hoping he wouldn't try something even crazier before I got there. The moment I pulled into the police station parking lot, Eric must have realized what was happening. He slammed his brakes, made a sharp U-turn, and sped off in the opposite direction. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath before deciding to go inside and report what had just happened. Explained everything to the officer at the front desk, but since Eric hadn't technically committed a crime, there wasn't much they could do. They noted the details in case anything else happened, but I left feeling like the situation wasn't really resolved. Later that night, I started getting angry messages from a number I didn't recognize. It was obvious it was Eric, furious that I hadn't fallen for his act. He called me names and even threw in some vague threats. I blocked the number right away and never heard from him again. Thankfully, I ended up selling the laptop a few days later to someone else without any issues. The whole deal went smoothly, and the buyer paid in cash, no weird behavior or drama. Still, the experience with Eric stuck with me long after. Since that night, I've completely stopped using Craigslist for selling or buying anything. I know, plenty of people use it without problems, but for me, it's just not worth the risk of running into someone like Eric again. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was that night. Things could have gone a lot worse if I hadn't driven straight to the police station. I still get a chill thinking about how desperate and aggressive he became over something as simple as a laptop. If there's one thing I learned, it's that you can never be too careful when meeting strangers online. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. A few years back, I had a really creepy experience trying to buy something off Craigslist. I was looking for a used laptop since I needed a new one for work, but didn't want to spend too much at a regular store. Craigslist seemed like the perfect place to score a good deal. After about half an hour of browsing, I came across a listing for a MacBook in great condition for a reasonable price. I messaged the seller, a guy named Mark, and he replied pretty quickly. He said the laptop was still available and suggested I come by his place the next night around 8:30 p.m. to check it out. The following evening, I grabbed the cash and drove to the address he had given me. It wasn't too far, just a few miles away. A neighborhood I wasn't super familiar with, but it looked quiet enough. I parked on the street in front of the house and texted Mark to let him know I was there. While waiting, I glanced around the property. That's when I noticed something weird. Behind the curtain of the living room window, I saw a man standing there, watching me. His face was half hidden, but I could feel his stare. Before I could react, he stepped back and vanished from view. Figured it was probably Mark, but then my phone buzzed with a message from him. He said he was still stuck in traffic but would be home soon and asked me to wait outside for a bit longer. That definitely threw me off. If Mark wasn't home yet, Then who was the guy I had just seen in the window? I started to feel uneasy, but convinced myself I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just a roommate or a relative. Minutes passed and the tension kept building. That's when I heard a faint noise coming from the back of the house. It sounded like a door being unlocked and shut carefully. My stomach twisted, but I still couldn't see anything from where I stood. More time ticked by. The street was quiet, and I felt completely alone out there. Just as I checked my phone again, a sudden sound behind me made my heart race. I turned around to see a man emerging from behind a tall wooden fence in the side yard. He was wearing dark clothes and his face was partially shadowed, but I could tell it was the same guy from the window. Before I could say anything, he started walking toward me. His steps were quick, deliberate, like he was testing how I'd react. My gut screamed that something was very wrong and I instinctively took a step back, but when he picked up his pace, I knew I had to run. Without thinking, I bolted. My legs just took off, pure adrenaline kicking in. I sprinted across the front lawn, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own footsteps. The guy was right behind me. I could hear him closing the distance with every step. I reached my car, fumbling to yank the door open. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 2 tries to unlock it. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, immediately locking it. The man was already there, yanking at the handle, trying to get in. He pounded on the window with his fist, twice, hard enough to make the glass rattle. I was so panicked I nearly dropped the keys trying to start the car. When the engine finally roared to life, I didn't waste a second. I floored it, tires screeching as I sped away. In my rearview mirror, I could see him standing there, watching. As I drove off, his figure getting smaller and smaller until he was just a dark shape in the distance. The entire drive home, my hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop replaying what had just happened. When I finally got home, I sat in my car for a minute trying to catch my breath. My hands were still trembling, and my mind was racing. I checked my phone again, hoping for some kind of explanation, but there were no new messages from Mark. That silence only made everything feel even weirder. Out of curiosity and fear, I went back on Craigslist to check the listing again, but it was gone, completely erased like it had never existed. I tried texting Mark one last time, but my message wouldn't go through. He had blocked me. That's when it hit me. Mark and the guy from the window were probably the same person. He must have been watching me the whole time, planning something. Maybe he never had a laptop to sell in the first place. I reported everything to Craigslist and filed a police report the next day. I don't know if they ever caught him, but I'm just thankful I trusted my gut and got out of there when I did. If I had waited a few seconds longer, I don't even want to think about how it could have ended. If you enjoyed the stories, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our work and never miss the next ones. Thank you.